911, do you need police, fire, medical?
My daughter's dead. She just had to go in there.
Sir, did she hang herself?
No, she didn't hang herself, but
How old is she?
around her. She's 11 years old.
On November 29, 2001, 12-year-old Amanda Cope was discovered dead from strangulation in her bed in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Tragically, her father Billy Cope discovered her and immediately fell into a state of shock. When the police arrived to investigate, they discovered a suspicious scene and quickly identified the main suspect. Hi and welcome back to Mysterious Cases 007. If you are new here, please consider subscribing, as it helps us motivate to create more intriguing content for you. Let's have a look at the case with the most insane twists you have ever heard. Now, without further ado, let's get started. In Rock Hill, South Carolina, when Billy Cope discovered his daughter Amanda dead in her bedroom in the early hours of November 29, 2001, he dialed 911. Billy Cope awoke about 3 a.m. with a start and quickly realized something was amiss in his home. The hall light was turned on, and he remembered turning it off before going to bed. His wife Mary Sue was away at an overnight job cleaning offices, leaving him and his 3 daughters Amanda, Jessica, and Kyla at home. Amanda was the oldest, at 12, while Jessica and Kyla were 11 and 7, respectively. They were a devout Christian family who had skipped the Wednesday church session they usually attended that night because Jessica was struggling with her maths homework and needed some additional assistance to finish it. Amanda, the compassionate elder sister, offered to assist her, and Billy consented to let the 2 girls remain up as long as it took to do the work. Kyla, the youngest daughter, went to bed at 9 p.m. But Billy stayed up with the older 2 sisters until 1 a.m., assisting them with their studies. They all went to bed after that to get some much-needed rest, and Billy had turned on his CPAP breathing machine, which he used to keep his sleep apnea at bay, before falling asleep. Strangely, he was awakened by something only 2 hours later. Billy went to check on his girls while still half asleep. Amanda's door was shut, so he assumed she was the one who turned on the hall light. Perhaps she awoke in the middle of the night for a drink of water. He opened the other bedroom door and found his 2 younger daughters fast asleep in their beds. With his mind at ease, he returned to his bed, turned on his breathing machine, and promptly fell back asleep. Billy was mocked the next morning at 6 a.m. by the blaring of his alarm clock. He later reported that he dreamed of the rapture during those sporadic hours of sleep. In his dream, Jesus reappeared to accompany his disciples home. In his dream, he witnessed Amanda being carried away and him being left behind, with her saying to him, "Bye, Daddy." He jumped out of bed, still shaken from his intense dream, to check on his girls. When he saw his 2 younger daughters still sleeping quietly in their beds, he was overcome with relief. But his relief was fleeting. He couldn't open Amanda's door because it was snagged on the open wardrobe door behind it. He encountered an unimaginable scene after forcing his way through the door. Amanda's body was motionless on her bed. When he reached out to touch her, she was ice cold, and he realized his worst nightmare had come true. He then wrapped his arms around her and dialed 911, still in shock. Within minutes, fire department paramedics were on the scene, but their life-saving equipment was rendered ineffective. Amanda had actually vanished. The Rock Hill Fire Department's Jason Dillon asked Billy what he thought had happened, and Billy told them that she may have choked on her blanket because she had a tendency of rolling in her sleep. Soon after, detectives came, secured the residence as an active crime scene, and began an investigation. Billy's reaction to his daughter's death piqued the detectives' interest right away. His serene demeanor appeared artificial, and he exhibited no emotion. Hundreds of detectives soon flooded the little house in search of clues, but the property was a shambles, with the family's things filling every room. Clothes were heaped on every surface, dishes were overflowing from the sinks, and cockroaches scurried into the corners. Amanda's body lay completely clothed on her bed, surrounded by her books and current school pictures she'd just received from the photographer. Investigators discovered that she had been battered and strangled to death after being assaulted. Her body was bruised, and the physical proof was discovered on her clothes. The evidence was gathered with the expectation that it may be utilized to identify the murderer. Police discovered another peculiarity while searching the house for clues. They discovered no traces of forced entry into the property after inspecting all of the doors and windows. All of the doors were locked from the inside. This indicated to investigators that the murderer was most likely from within the residence. The investigator approached Billy and inquired about Amanda's death. Billy claimed she was strangled in her sleep by her blanket, which contradicted the evidence at the crime scene. The detectives understood they needed to look farther. When they looked into his background, they discovered that he and his wife had both pled guilty to ignoring the proper care of their children 2 years previously. This, together with his cold reaction to her death, his weird story of how she died, and the fact that there were no traces of forced entry into the house, was the final piece of information they required. Billy appeared to be the primary suspect in the police investigation. They transported him downtown to the police station for further questioning. Detectives interrogated Billy aggressively over the next few days. Over the next 4 days, he was subjected to 17 hours of interrogation. Billy was questioned by detectives for 3.5 hours on the first day of interrogation, November 29, 2001, the same day of the murder. Detectives had no doubt that he had committed the heinous act as a consequence of their initial interrogation. All they needed was a confession from him. However, according to the interrogation records, Billy protested his innocence over 650 times on that first day. He informed the cops that he loved his girls and that he would never hurt Amanda. He stated that the only reason he didn't hear anything that night was that his sleep apnea equipment was so loud that it drowned out any outside noise. This looked improbable to the investigators, who continued to question Billy in order to elicit a confession from him. Billy, on the other hand, refused to admit to the crime. They attempted to use his faith against him, claiming that he would burn in hell for what he done. They also sought to convince him that the physical evidence they had gathered was a match for him, so he would have nowhere to hide. Regardless of what they stated, Billy maintained his denial of any participation in his daughter's murder. Finally, as they approached the 4th hour of interrogation on the second day, Billy requested a polygraph or lie detector exam, hoping that it would finally prove his innocence. Unfortunately, this is where Billy's life began to disintegrate. Soon after starting his polygraph, the person conducting the exam slammed his hand down on the table and informed the detectives that they had enough evidence to halt the test. He looked Billy in the eyes and informed him that he had failed the test. Billy was heartbroken. Following these findings, police pressed Billy further, curious as to why he'd done such a horrible thing to his daughter. Billy gradually began to speak. Billy ultimately confessed, although he appeared to be unsure of his own words. The initial confession ended with him making a formal statement admitting to murdering his own daughter. But that would not be the end of it. Billy had given the police 4 distinct confessions by the end of the 4th day of interrogation, and none of them matched each other or coincided with the evidence at the crime site. Amanda was beaten with a broom in one confession, but this was not mentioned in any of his other confessions. Some confessions contained a dream, but in other admissions, the dream was omitted or described in a very different way. None of the specifics from each confession jibed with one another. Despite this, investigators accepted them as the truth, despite their belief that Billy was extremely mentally disturbed. The 4th and last confession was a video reenactment in which the police took him back to his house and taped him as he recounted his actions on the night of the murder. Billy was eventually accused as the single offender in his daughter's death as a result of his numerous confessions. However, following these lengthy interrogations, Billy recanted all of his confessions and protested his innocence in court once more. Regardless, the damage was done, and Billy was sentenced to prison with no bond or bail. The investigation appeared to be complete. It had been a year since the murder. Billy had confessed to the crime, and many people, including those who knew him, were now convinced of his guilt. But Billy was now claiming his innocence all over again. Phil Beatty, a Rock Hill private attorney, was now assigned to fight this case in court on his behalf. Phil acknowledges that when he first met Billy, he assumed he was guilty. His strategy for the case was to try to get Billy the best possible plea agreement and simply put the situation behind him. However, after speaking with Billy about the interrogation procedure in the days following the murder, Beatty was horrified by what he'd heard. When his appointed public defender, B.J. When Baraclow arrived at the police station, he was denied access to the interrogation room to see Billy, a clear breach of his rights. They supplied a memo apparently signed by Billy stating that he did not want to meet his attorney at that time. When Beryl Chloe claimed that they could have pressured him into writing this note, they simply refused to allow him to question his client. Only after his fourth confession did his defense lawyer, B.J. Beryl Chloe, was given permission to see him. When he questioned Billy why he'd signed the confession, he told him that the police had threatened him with the death penalty if he didn't. Beatty was stunned by the obvious infringement of Billy's rights. However, because the admissions were written and signed, he was concerned whether this information would help his case. In late 2002, Beatty received a phone call from the prosecutor's office requesting a meeting. He agreed to meet with them, thinking it was about a deal for his client, but he had no idea what they were about to tell him. They brought him down and told him that the DNA recovered on Amanda's body had finally been processed, and to everyone's amazement, it was not Billy's. Beatty was both astonished and relieved to hear this news, since it meant that his client was suddenly innocent and that he had a real possibility of winning this case. But what they told him next shocked him even more. He was told that the police knew within a few weeks of the murder that the DNA did not match Billy, but they kept this information from him for almost a year. Beatty was enraged by this. He couldn't believe such a heinous injustice had occurred and that no one had considered this information important enough to alert Billy's lawyers about it before now. But then he paused and inquired as to why they had decided to reveal this information to him now, after all these months. If only they'd known it wasn't Billy's DNA all those years ago when the final piece of knowledge was revealed to him. He was told that the reason he was being told all of this now was that the police had discovered a match to the DNA in the system and knew to whom it belonged. It belonged to one James Sanders. There is little known about James Sanders' past, where he came from, or what he was doing before 2001. All that is known is that he was a career criminal who had committed a number of crimes before this heinous one. He'd just been released from prison and moved into the same neighborhood as the Copes 2 weeks before murdering Amanda. He resided in a house just 2 blocks away from Billy and his family. There is no proof that the two guys knew each other, and they would have made an unusual couple. According to his counsel, Billy Cope was a socially isolated 385-pound Caucasian male. He was a passionate Christian and aspiring preacher as well. James Sanders, on the other hand, was a newly released African-American career criminal and drug addict. Sanders perpetrated or attempted to conduct 4 more sexual assaults in the neighborhood in the 6 weeks following Amanda's murder in November 2001. Now that his attorneys learned there was another individual whose DNA was recovered at the crime scene, they realized Billy was in fact innocent. They then questioned him seriously about why he'd given fake confessions to police when questioned shortly after the murder. Billy told his lawyers that he was confident of his innocence when questioned by police in the hours following the murder. But he'd also been in shock after losing his daughter in such a horrific way. As a result, he may have appeared emotionless to them. He also admitted to giving phony admissions in order to confound the cops. He believed that his admissions would be worthless unless police could prove them, and he didn't feel the evidence would support any of his confessions. However, he was mistaken in this case, as the police were willing to accept his confessions despite the fact that none of them matched each other or the evidence collected at the site. Despite the fact that Sanders was present on the night Amanda was murdered, Billy was charged with a crime. The case went to trial in 2004, and the trial was centered on both sides attempting to show what happened the night of the murder. While Billy's lawyers claimed that Billy had no involvement in his daughter's death, prosecutors found an easy explanation for both Billy's confessions and the newly discovered DNA evidence. They claimed that the only reasonable conclusion was that both guys were complicit and committed the crime together. According to the authorities, this is why there was no evidence of forced entry into the residence, because Billy had let Sanders in and then locked them up when he departed. Cope's attorneys claimed that prosecutors were simply presenting the material in this manner to cover up their illegal interrogation practices. They claimed Cope had mental problems and was so distraught about his daughter's murder that investigators were able to trick him into admitting to a crime he did not commit. The defense was also barred from presenting critical evidence to the jury by Judge John C. Hayes III on the grounds that it might lead the jury to a logical fallacy. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry in the forced sexual assaults perpetrated or attempted by Sanders in the weeks following Amanda's murder was removed as evidence. Sanders appears to have been a master of breaking and entering, leaving little evidence for even the most seasoned of detectives to find. Another crucial piece of evidence that the defense counsel was not permitted to introduce to the jury was testimony from a jailhouse informant who claimed he overheard Sanders admitting to raping and killing a young girl in Rock Hill. This kind of testimony is frequently permitted by courts when they aid prosecutors, but in this case, when they could have aided the defendant, they were not permitted. While it may appear to you that Billy had no involvement in his daughter's death, the jury did not see it that way. Sanders and Billy were both convicted and charged with conspiracy, which means they worked together to perpetrate the crime. In 2004, they were each sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision was overturned on appeal in April 2009, when a three-judge panel from the South Carolina Court of Appeals ruled that there was no evidence that Cope and Sanders knew each other. However, the South Carolina Attorney General quickly appealed this ruling, and it was overturned in 2013. Cope's conviction was maintained by the state high court, and the United States High Court declined to consider his appeal. Despite all of the evidence pointing to Billy's innocence, he remained imprisoned. Billy Cope died of natural causes in state custody on February 9, 2017, at the age of 53. He was never allowed to leave his jail cell after being charged with the murder of his own daughter. We'll let you determine whether he was genuinely guilty or not. And there you have it, folks, the horrific story of Amanda Cope's murder and the nightmare ordeal that followed for her father, Billy. What are your thoughts on the case? Do you believe Billy was guilty or innocent? More significantly, was Amanda Cope's justice served? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you appreciated the video. Stay safe until next time, and thanks for watching.